Hello everybody and welcome to the Wednesday edition of Video Clips. And I mentioned yesterday that my Monday newsletter article had contained a lot of data on how the number of cases is being inflated, and we don't really have any idea based on testing, and also some misbehavior as that pertains to categorizing the deaths. And so the newsletter article is like 6 pages long, and I'm not going to read it to you all here. I just want to share a couple of things though that I think that you should know about. So the first thing is that the testing that we're doing right now is ineffective from a strategy standpoint. One of the reasons is that most of the people who are being tested in the United States have symptoms, or they've been in contact with somebody who's known to test positive for COVID-19. Now, most people exposed to COVID-19 are asymptomatic, so had we done a wider population sampling, we would likely have shown a higher infection rate, which could have been misconstrued to make everybody sideways by unscrupulous people who get on television every day, but also would likely show that the incidence of severe symptoms and death is really very, very low. And we have a model for this. In Iceland, volunteer samples were tested, which is about as close to random as you can get, and it was determined that the infection rate was less than 1%. And also that the death rate was less than 1%. And so the government of Iceland concluded that the seasonal flu was actually considerably more deadly than COVID-19. Now, we didn't do this type of testing in the United States, but it may not have mattered because the testing systems were screwed up from the get-go. So the World Health Organization had developed testing specifications for COVID-19 by January, but the CDC, for some unknown reason, decided that it would develop its own test, and it was ready by February. And within a very short time of sending it out to health centers, everybody knew that there was a problem and the test was inaccurate. And the FDA, for a reason I can't understand, issued guidelines saying that hospitals, academic centers, and private companies should not develop their own tests. Okay, so we have an inaccurate test, but don't develop any others. Well, the FDA finally lifted the ban at the end of February, and then everybody came flooding into the market to get tests ready for the market. And the feds had set no standards for how COVID-19 was supposed to be detected, so the test makers just got to make up their own stuff. The tests were then approved under emergency authorization from the FDA, which meant that they only had to be proven useful in test tubes and no actual clinical trials required. This is a big problem, according to David Pride, medical doctor, associate director of microbiology at the University of California, San Diego. There were so many issues that were never addressed. One is cross-reactivity with other viruses, which would lead to false positives. Another is that the coronavirus remains in a person's system. The fragments are there long after the infectious period, so invariably you're going to have many, many people test positive and unfairly quarantined because these things don't have time markers on them. And the risk of cross-contamination is really, really significant, particularly when you're doing such rushed work in such crowded circumstances. So there are most likely an awful lot of false positives and probably false negatives too. Pride points out that the tests are produced by several vendors and each one established its own and as yet unmeasured accuracy. So essentially all the test makers who were in a rush to get something out there because it was economically incredibly advantageous to do this, as you might imagine, they were subject to no standards. They made up their own standards, and nobody has determined if those standards are valid or not. Dr. Pride says that some tests will detect as few as 100 copies of a viral gene, while others require 400 copies. So some are more sensitive than others. And so the bottom line is that at this particular point in time, how many cases we have, God knows. I don't think we know at all. Another thing that's going on is the CDC has actually issued instructions. I downloaded the piece so in case it disappears, downloaded it to my computer, and I'll just read what it says. In cases where a definite diagnosis of COVID cannot be made but is suspected or likely, then it is acceptable to report COVID-19 on a death certificate as probable or presumed. So in other words, when in doubt, classify any death possible as COVID-19, which will serve to inflate the numbers and make it look like the projections are alive or are significant and right, and keep this whole ginned up mess going on. And if you need documentation for this, I've got references in this in the article, but Dr. Deborah Birx sits on the White House Task Force, and she actually announced during a press conference earlier this week on April 7th that the deaths of all patients who die with coronavirus, even if the cause of death is not due to it, should list COVID-19 as the cause of death. She was questioned about this, by the way, and acknowledged that other countries don't do it, but she said that's the way we're going to do it here. Now, the first thing that I'll give you an analogy, most men in the world die, if they live long enough, they die with prostate cancer, but not of it. So can you imagine if we put prostate cancer on the death certificate of all men who die over the age of 70, they almost all have it. My gosh, it would look like prostate cancer was killing them. I don't know how people would respond to that other than with panic, because it has nothing to be concerned about. Most men don't die of it, all right? Well, Dr. Scott Jansen, a Minnesota family practice doctor and state senator, says that this means a patient who died after being hit by a bus and tested positive for coronavirus would be listed as having presumed to have died from the virus regardless of any damage that was caused by the bus. And he says that he personally received a 7-page document from CDC instructing him to do this. And he was asked on a radio show or television show that I watched, what was the motivation? He says, fear is a great way to control people, he told a television station. When Anthony Fauci was asked about the number of coronavirus deaths being padded, what he cited as the prevalence of conspiracy theories during challenging times in public health. Well, this isn't a conspiracy theory. Fauci's sidekick, Dr. Birx, said on national television that they were doing it. I mean, if Fauci worked for me, he wouldn't be working for me for very long. I think this guy's questionable. But I'll tell you what happens when this kind of thing happens is it gives license to other people to exaggerate and misappropriate. So during a press conference, this happened pretty recently, Governor Ned Lamont announced that a 6-week-old baby had died and tested positive for coronavirus, and this was most likely the youngest victim yet of coronavirus. His tweet read, "It is with heartbreaking sadness today that we can confirm the first pediatric fatality in Connecticut linked to COVID-19. A 6-week newborn from the Hartford area was brought unresponsive to a hospital late last week and could not be revived." He went on to say, quote, "This is a virus that attacks our most fragile without mercy. Your life, this stresses the importance of staying home and limiting exposure to other people. Your life and the lives of others could literally depend on it. Our prayers are with the family at this difficult time." Well, the problem is that's not what happened at all. In fact, the state's medical examiner refused to certify death from coronavirus. Toxicology tests are pending, and the medical examiner indicated the possibility that the child had an underlying condition or might have died of sudden infant death syndrome or positional asphyxiation. But the damage had been done. Lamont had waxed eloquent in front of the public, saying no one is safe from this virus, and he issued this warning. For those young people who think that maybe they're a little more invincible, think again. Well, the public became more frightened, more likely to do as they were told. Stay home, don't congregate, continue to follow directions. I mean, he succeeded in promoting a false story, and once those stories are out there, it's very difficult to retract. It's not the only episode in which a young person's death has been attributed to coronavirus, only it really wasn't. 21-year-old Chloe Middleton died from coronavirus, according to her family. She was taken to the hospital after having a heart attack and died shortly after that. Coroner said the cause of death was related to COVID-19 because the family said she had a cough. The hospital had not recorded it as COVID-19 because she had not tested positive. In this case, they tested her and she wasn't positive. Well, the family eventually took down a Facebook post claiming that Chloe had no underlying health issues. They've refused to speak with reporters who've tried to check out the story. But in the meantime, the coroner's office issued this statement: Chloe died at Wexham Park Hospital on 19 March 2020. The case was reported to the Berkshire Coroner's Office. Her death was very sad, but as she had a natural cause of death, involvement by the coroner was not required, and the hospital issued a death certificate. There was no postpartum examination or inquest. We must now respect the privacy of the family and cannot provide any further information. So there is no coronavirus death here. And unfortunately, I could give you 25 more stories that people have sent to me similar to this, where public officials, elected officials, have just gotten right on television and lied about stuff. I mean, I told you yesterday about our public health director here talking about putting bodies at the convention center. What bodies and why? I mean, what would motivate somebody to say these I mean, I don't know what else to call it. It's nonsensical stuff. So anyway, very sad, but let me say this. I am very sorry for the people who are actually dealing with this virus. I don't like to see anybody die ever. In my perfect world, we'd all live forever. But having said that, there's no way to avoid people getting sick and dying. And vulnerable people are the ones who are getting sick and dying. So we'll have a long discussion after this mess is all over about how to take better care of yourself. We'll reintroduce that back into the discussion. But right now, one of the ways to take care of yourself is to make sure that you're not buying the misinformation that is being given out through the media every single day. It's exhausting to watch. I have to watch it so I can report it to you, but it's exhausting to watch. As usual, pass this on to anybody who you think would enjoy watching it. I'll be back to you tomorrow with more news.